Hi, I'm Wyatt Cash at Scoop News Group, and we're here at Cyber Talks with Megan Good, Vice President and Director of the Leidos Cyber Accelerator at Leidos. Megan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start by asking, what does it mean to have a baseline level of cybersecurity in 2021 in this sort of emerging post-pandemic era?
It's a great question, and I really feel it's one I could answer two ways. So first and foremost, I could say, nothing's changed, right? A baseline level of cybersecurity still involves looking at the kinds of devices you have, the kinds of data that's in your environment, perhaps the kind of visibility you have of those devices and that data, the level of risk, the kinds of operations that you're doing on that data, and that would inform that risk and your risk management kind of capabilities, and how you handle that, how you manage it over time. That, I think, has still persisted as what we think is the challenge of the day of how to get to that baseline level of cybersecurity. But what I think has changed a lot in 2021 is that there's this shift because the perimeter is really disappearing very quickly. As you're building in capabilities that might be as a service, that might be hosted in a cloud, that might be hosted somewhere completely different than where your a more traditional or legacy environment might have been, as folks are accessing from new devices. It really has a shift that we've seen for the baseline level of cybersecurity going towards that endpoint view. And what are those devices? What is that data? Where is it? And all of that has really upped the game from the endpoint detection and response perspective, while still making sure that those perimeter and more of our traditional sorts of capabilities need to stay in place as well. So I think it's one of those where there's a bit of it that's the same and a bit that's shifting, and we can continue to see it evolve.
Mm-hmm. Well, reflecting back just briefly, how did the pandemic affect the way that organizations are securing their data now?
Well, I think as I just said, there was no perimeter for a while, right? There was a lot of the organization's data that was not being accessed in the traditional office spaces or in the environments that they probably were initially designed for. And really, it started to get to who's accessing this data, who's protecting it, and how are they protecting it in different locations, like at home? And do we know where those folks are? Do we know what they're looking at that data for and when they're working, perhaps? And so there were a lot of changes that I think more mature organizations were looking at as far as some of their user behavior analytics in that time and how that could help them secure their data. And really, with other organizations, they had to leapfrog their data security because they were adding additional capabilities in to support a more remote workforce. So I think the pandemic, the overall look at it is it made data itself and the securities around that data much more critical, as if it wasn't already in the past. And I think it certainly accelerated that focus on moving towards zero trust, where it's about evaluating that decision about devices and users and the data that they can access. And we can see that in things like the recent presidential executive order, but it's really sped up the demand for that kind of technology and enhancing our capabilities around securing data.
Mm-hmm. Well, next, let me ask, what kinds of changes do you expect to see in the cyber world over the coming year?
Well, immediately, I would say that executive order has had its impact, and we'll see that throughout our industry and then with the federal government. And I think, it will percolate through other organizations as well, other layers of government. And there will be some counteractions to some of the capabilities that are in there that we'll see from maybe more of an adversarial perspective as well. I also think this year we've seen a lot in the headlines about very high profile kinds of attacks from many different sorts of attack vectors. And I think with that, the success of some of those, we'll certainly see those coming. And I think the interesting part of that we'll see is that it's really touching things that people care about. And it's things in the real world. It's not so much that these incidents and events are just happening in our technology space. It's not something that is just over there and you can say, oh, that's not going to affect me. It has had impacts on people, and I think we'll continue to see that grow until we really strike a better balance from a defensive perspective. I also think that we're creating more complex environments that offer more challenges. And overall, from a technologist perspective, from an engineering perspective, that makes us really need to build better systems, more resilient systems that can operate through the kinds of attacks that we're seeing. And I think the service offerings are really going to come this year. So we'll see a change, and by 2022, we'll see what we say, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, lastly, Megan, what is the biggest thing that you think most people don't really appreciate or maybe understand about cybersecurity in the broader government IT sector?
Yeah, I think the one that I would point to is it seems that it's easy to say when an event happened, what went wrong, right? What were the things that weren't done right? And it's easy to place the blame on this wasn't done at the right level. It didn't have enough protections. And hindsight is easy in that way. But I think what people don't appreciate all the time is how complex these environments are, how difficult it is to be perfectly right when it's only one incident that really makes something so impactful. And there could be a series of decisions in there, but there are a lot of capabilities that we have within our environments. And there's a lot of goodness to adding those technologies as they enable the kind of work that we're able to do. But it really does open up a new place that we have to secure. And for the cybersecurity industry, that means that we constantly have to be on our game. Anytime that there's a new trend or there's a new technology out there, we have to make sure that there are other sorts of ways that we can view what's happening to it and protect it. And so I think what I would share with folks is it's hard and it's complex and it's changing all the time, but we're really up for the challenge to build more resilient enterprises.
Well, Megan, good. Thank you so much for sharing some of those insights with our audience and taking time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.